So this week I crossed a big milestone. I hit 1,000 drawings. So I decided I'm going to flip back through all the drawings I've done so far and kind of talk about what I've learned. So this is kind of where I ended up. I'm going to flip to the beginning in a second, but I just wanted to give you a glimpse of how far I've gotten. I know this. I know none of this is great. In fact, a few of these I feel like are pretty bad. But as you're going to see in a second, I really have learned a lot. And before I even started learning to draw, I had this feeling that anyone could learn to do it. I really believe that pretty much anyone can learn to do anything as long as they put in the time and effort. And I think that's what holds a lot of people back more than like talent or something like that. So when I decided to teach myself to draw, I decided to share just like everything that I drew. This is literally everything I've drawn so far, and I plan to continue sharing everything I draw for as long as that remains feasible. And it hasn't been too difficult. But I think this really, I'm not really that good at drawing yet, but I definitely know how to draw at this point. At this point, it's just me getting better. I really feel like this does go to show that, anyone can learn to draw. If you want to learn to draw, you just have to keep doing it, and you will learn. I mean, it helps to try and learn from other people a bit. It helps to mix things up, and there's things like that. But if you draw every day, eventually you're going to get better. So I decided to start teaching myself to draw on 3/27/17. So I'd wanted to learn for a long time. I needed some art assets for some projects I was working on. Not that I ever got to the point where I was making those. And then I started watching YouTubers who were kind of making videos of their drawings, and it got me really interested in learning again. So one day I decided, well, I'm just going to do at least one drawing every day, and we'll see where it gets. That's kind of the gist of it. So that was a little over 4 months ago. Since then, I've drawn 1,008 drawings, or at least that's how many pictures are in this album. That means I've averaged about 7 3/4 drawings per day, whatever that means. My goal is only to draw at least one thing per day, and there's been a few days where I have only drawn one thing, but there's been some days where I just felt like blasting through paper, and so I drew, 10 or 20 things. So this is the first thing I drew as part of this. Yeah, it's terrible. I was watching some tutorials on shading and rendering, and that's just kind of where I started. The tutorials were labeled as beginner drawing tutorials, but really I don't feel like that's where you need to start. I really feel like you could start anywhere. But then I just kind of played around with some of that stuff for a while, and played around with some of the different pens and pencils I had laying around. And that's really what I did for quite some time. This is my fiance had bought me some of those Inktense watercolor pencils, and I tried doing something with them. It's not great, but there it is. And then I had a bunch of other, pens and watercolor paints laying around, so I just started opening that stuff and trying it out. When you're starting out, it really is very hard to decide what you're going to draw. So I looked at various learning tutorials, and I just ended up drawing a bunch of random shapes and trying to render them to make them look kind of interesting, and trying to make different textures and stuff. I mean, none of this really matters. As long as I was putting down marks and trying to learn something, it was fine. That's what I did for a while. I tried to do some drawings from, things I had around the house, and I feel like some of that stuff came out okay. But most of it was really just, making marks on paper, and it wasn't really much beyond that. Eventually I started doing these circle and line kind of scribble drawings, and I did a lot of these. I feel like I got this idea from a tutorial that I was watching, and I feel like I started doing this on big newsprint paper, and it just was super relaxing to just not worry about it and just make a bunch of marks. And I'd recommend it to anyone. If you're starting out, just do this. It's fun. You don't have to worry about getting anything right. And eventually it leads you into trying to make different shapes and patterns. Or even if it doesn't, I'm sure that's fine too. As long as you're having fun, it doesn't matter. I think I drew every camera that I own. At the time, I was fairly proud of this. Looking back, you you see a lot of the mistakes you made. I feel like part of it is maybe in the photo too, but this stuff is really distorted. And I think that's a big thing, is like every time you make something, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to learn from it. And so you're a better artist when you end each piece than when you start it. Meaning a lot of times you'll finish and you won't be too happy with aspects of it, but that's just life. I mean, I remember being fairly happy with some of this stuff at the time, but now looking at it, I don't really like any of it too much. Or it's not what I would do now. And I'm not like, I mean, I've only been drawing for 4 months, so I'm not way better than I was. But I feel like I've definitely improved quite a bit in those 4 months. Eventually I decided I wanted to try and like blast through some of my watercolors. I have a bunch of old paints and stuff from when I was a kid that I never used. But it turned out I still have a lot of that watercolor, because it turns out that like watercolor lasts for a long time. Like I've blown through a bunch of pens and pencils doing this, but I still haven't managed to kill off that watercolor. I eventually did buy some other watercolors because I was kind of tired of using watercolors where they don't even say what they are. So a part of me doesn't want to learn to use those paints and then not be able to replace them, even though I don't think they're the greatest paints. But I eventually started bouncing between kind of like charcoal on newsprint, which is fun, and I haven't done that in a while, so I probably should go back to it. And then like pen and ink, and I tried a bunch of different approaches to pen and ink. I do think pen and ink is kind of what I favor still. I think drawing with charcoal is sort of viscerally pleasing. It's very fun to do, but I don't necessarily love how it comes out most of the time. And I tend to really like how like pen and cross hatching comes out, which you can see in my more kind of recent efforts. And then I do want to get good at painting, but there's a whole extra level of difficulty with painting. You have to deal with color, and you have to deal with like mixing things, and then there's there's brush strokes and all kinds of stuff. And I feel like I've gotten better. You get better by just doing it. And I watch some tutorials and stuff too, but I think it'll be a long time before I really get good at painting. We'll see. Eventually, I think this was several weeks in, I decided to do a sort of more detailed charcoal piece to kind of test my drawing skills. And for the most part, I think it came out okay. I'm not super into realism, so this isn't the kind of thing that I would do a whole lot of. But I think you learn a lot by doing realistic pieces, because it forces you to really focus on details, because a lot of realism comes out of details, like the way these reflections look and the grain in the wood. And so I do think I learned a lot just by doing this. So it'd be a good idea to do a few more of these, or, do these every once in a while. My problem with realism is, for one, I don't think it's that interesting to look at. I think it's weird because it appeals a lot to people on the internet, it seems like. Sometimes I browse the art on Reddit, and a lot of the stuff that ends up at the top is sort of photorealistic stuff. But I mean, like, I feel like when you're drawing or like painting, it's a chance to, express things stylistically and sort of play with color and mood and stuff like that. So doing like super photorealistic and accurate artwork, I don't know, it doesn't do much for me. And then it's also really time consuming. Like, this is probably the most time I put into anything I've done, which I think this took me about 5 or 6 hours. And it's not even that photorealistic. You can look at this and definitely tell it's a drawing. Like, there's parts of this where, when you zoom out, it looks fairly photorealistic. But I think I'd probably have to put like 10, 15 hours into something to get it to look photorealistic, and it just doesn't seem worth it to me. Other people might feel differently. I mean, clearly a lot of people do that, so other people do feel differently. After that, I kind of started playing around with doing more traditional learning methods. So I started doing like blind contour drawings and I don't know what to call these. I went through some traditional art books like The Natural Way to Draw. I think that's what it's called. Um, and I think doing this stuff kind of helped. It looks really bad at first. I did a whole lot of this stuff and eventually started mixing in more like gestural drawing. And I think the interesting thing here is, yeah, it looks really bad at first, but then as you keep doing it, you become faster. So a lot of these things were timed drawings. So like, between a minute and 5 minutes. Some of them are even like 15-second, like quick draw things. But it's interesting because it really builds your speed of laying down sort of the information to convey the image. And eventually, like I really did a whole lot of this, and I'll probably do more of this soon. Eventually, you really are able to capture the pertinent information very quickly. And I think that helps you in a couple ways. So I think one of the biggest aspects of becoming a good artist is patience, because drawing really does take a long time. And if you can make it fun, I'll probably talk about this a couple times here, but if you can make it fun, it really takes some of the pain out of it. So you have to find the fun in putting in those details, because it takes a long time to get the details and information captured in a convincing way. And then on top of that, like capturing that stuff can be kind of tedious. But if you can become faster, then you need a little bit less patience. So I think those two things go hand in hand, becoming faster and becoming more patient. Those two things really make you a lot better. Like for example, I think this is a 1-minute drawing, but I mean, you can tell it's fairly quickly done, but when you zoom out a bit, it's pretty accurate, I think. I'm pretty happy with that one. There's a couple other ones that I was fairly happy with. And this is kind of towards the end point of where I stopped doing these. But I think if I spent, another couple weeks working on that, I would get even much further. But I think it was only like 2 weeks and I did, these are easily hundreds of pages of drawings. There was a few weeks where I was probably averaging 10, 15 drawings per day. And the reason is a lot of them were quick, they would be just a couple minutes each instead of putting, 20, 30 minutes into a drawing. And then I decided to blast through a bunch of these charcoal on newsprint drawings. And a part of this was also building speed and just kind of building the ability to capture ideas, and also forcing me to create ideas. Like I wanted to get through a stack of this paper in a week, so it was a fun challenge. It made me just lay down things and not worry too much about what I was going to draw. And I think some of it turned out pretty cool. Like this was just me spinning the charcoal around on the paper, but I think it looks pretty cool. And a lot of these is just like me, waving the charcoal around on the paper on its side and then outlining it. And it kind of has this cool graffiti kind of look to it. And then I did some more of these sort of figure drawing in charcoal, which some of these I feel like turned out pretty well. I actually really like this one still. I feel like it's not super realistic or accurate, but it has a sort of style to it that I find appealing. But yeah, this is a fun thing to do, is just try to blast through a stack of paper. And really, that's how I thought of a lot of my drawing is, if my goal is to make a drawing a day, then really my goals center around just killing paper. And that's basically how I've been teaching myself to draw, is just trying to get rid of paper and art supplies. Some of these landscapes I actually think came out pretty cool too. These are from photo reference, but it took me a minute to draw them. I really think doing these sort of speed sketches are a good way to build up that speed if you don't have patience. And I'm a person that doesn't really have a lot of patience. I've definitely learned some patience since starting to draw, but I still don't really have the patience to do anything that takes more than maybe a couple hours. That one 5-hour one was an exception. And I'm sure eventually I'll build up to being able to do more, but I guess I continue doing a few more of these uh, figure drawings after that, but it looks like only a few. Here I am trying to go through watercolor again. This is laying down masking fluid and then just doing a wash and then coming back later with a pen and kind of rendering in some forms. I tried this a few different ways and I don't really love any of this stuff. I thought this one came out pretty cool. It's like a bunch of spaceships or like a spaceship battle or something. It could probably look cooler if I knew how to make these forms look better, but overall, I think this is the coolest one, in my opinion. Something I noticed when I was working on the figure drawing is that I am not very good at perspective. I started trying to do some of these background skeletons where you sort of use it to construct a figure sort of from the imagination. I used a combination of reference and trying to use those skeletons, but I felt like I was struggling to get some of the forms to look right in perspective, so I started working on perspective a little bit. And that's probably something I really need to spend a lot of time on. It's a little tedious because there's a lot of, you use a ruler or you just carefully lay in the perspective grids, and it's kind of tedious, but you can make some pretty cool stuff pretty easily, like especially if you render it better than I do. At the time I was trying to blow through some ballpoint pens, and I did eventually kill off the pens that I had. Now I have a bunch of other ones, but lately I haven't really been feeling like using ballpoint, so I eventually switched to using mostly Micron and technical pens. But when I draw in these notebooks, which I'm trying to get rid of these notebooks over time, those pens I think will bleed. So in fact, the ballpoint even bleeds if you draw with it enough. When you make a really dark area, it'll bleed through. This perspective kind of got me into wanting to do a bunch of these sort of weird geometric forms, and I even started doing these sort of geometric origami to go along with that. I think it could be cool to draw on the origami, which is what I was trying to do, or make the origami and then draw it, which I haven't done, but the origami actually took, I think some of these this one probably took a couple hours to make, and like I said, I don't know if I have the patience for that. Plus, it keeps falling apart, and some of the instructions aren't that great, so I don't know. I don't know how much origami I'll do, but I think it could look cool if you're into it. Eventually, I bought a little sketchbook and started doing sketches during the day. I can't really do a whole lot of drawing during the day because I can't really draw during the day where I usually draw, which is in my garage, because I stay at home with my kid, and I have to be in the house with the kid. So, but when I get a chance during the day, I've started sort of doing these little doodles and sketches. And I think this has actually been one of the things that has helped me get a lot better because it just lets me draw more. And even if you work, I probably only draw maybe 10 to 15 hours a week, maybe a couple hours every night at most, and then maybe an hour during the day split up. So even if you work, you could easily draw at least as much as I do, because you can draw in your evenings and you can draw during the day on breaks or whatever. It wouldn't be too hard to find the time to draw as much as I do. Anytime you want to learn to do something, you kind of have to make sacrifices. So I've given up video games pretty much completely, and more or less I've stopped watching TV. I have probably one TV night a week where I'll kind of catch up on Game of Thrones or whatever. So yeah, anyway, after that, so then I also started playing around with the Spirograph kit. I had bought the Spirograph kit to have something in case I ever got so bored or whatever that I couldn't think of anything to draw. And eventually it became clear that wasn't really going to be a problem. So I decided to open it up and play around with it. It was actually a lot less fun than I expected it to be. If you watch my video on that, you would kind of get why. But I found it kind of frustrating to use, and you can see a lot of these are broken and messed up. I think part of it is just you have to practice using it, and maybe some of the things I was doing with it were kind of not good. But I'll play around with it some more in the future. I got some tips recently, so maybe some of that'll help. And then, I kept doing some of these doodles. After the spirographs, I started playing around with graffiti because I felt like some of my doodles were kind of boring. So I wanted to learn to do some of these cool embellishments that you see in graffiti. It seems like kind of a leap, but I feel like graffiti is all about embellishment. It's about taking a fairly basic shape and making it look cool. So I started playing around with that. I also am working on some other little projects slowly. I'm hoping maybe it'll help me create a logo for that. That's why there's a bunch of bees. A lot of this just involved, drawing a letter and then trying to make it look cool or interesting. Most of them aren't great, but it was fun. It's fun. I would recommend it to anyone. It's actually more fun than I thought it would be. I actually started a second sketchbook just for doing letters. Some of this stuff is actually from reference, so I printed up some random fonts that I thought looked cool and kind of copied them, and then I would try to modify them a little bit. I can't remember what's what here, but yeah, I think some of that's cool. I think this is something I created. I don't remember what the original looked like. You can tell because it doesn't look very good. But this is probably more or less copied from the original. I've still been doing some of these watercolors to kind of try to blow through some of my old paint, but I still have a whole bunch of that paint left, so I'll probably have that around for a while. And then lately I've kind of just been doing a lot of doodling. This is getting into the past few weeks. For one, it's been kind of hot, so some nights I haven't really felt like going to the garage because it gets super hot in my garage. And I try to cool it off, but there seems to be no escape. So, I don't know, I feel like some combination of doing all this figure drawing and then some of this other perspective blowing through that stack of paper and doing the graffiti, it really started to push my doodling ability forward. I don't think some of this stuff is great, but it's a lot more interesting than what I was doing before. And I could see how you might take something like this and use it as a seed to do something really cool. My kind of long-term goal is to be able to do concept art, and so I think I'm actually starting to push towards being able to do that, or at least be able to capture sketches that could become concepts for worlds or games or whatever. And a lot of this is just me, laying down some random shapes and then trying to give it more meaning. I probably lay down a curve and then another curve, and then eventually I just create this weird squiggly plant monster. It's interesting. I can't really say exactly what pushed me forward. With the figure drawing, it was just practice and repetition of doing the same thing. But then somehow this combination of doing a whole bunch of random different things, I also feel like it really gave me some sort of leap forward. I mean, I recognize that the stuff isn't great, but then there really is some sort of jump that happened recently, in my opinion. Throughout all of this, I've been kind of mixing up watching tutorials and then doing some drawing, watching tutorials, trying different things. So I really think, the kind of mixing things up and then mixing in sort of outside ideas, looking at other people's art for reference, looking at other people's tutorials, really started to push my abilities forward. A lot of this stuff happened slowly and in the background. I wasn't really aware of it happening. I wasn't really aware that I was becoming much better, which is it's really strange thing to happen. It's all of a sudden things are better. And I mean, some of this is still really bad. Again, this is something you could take and then do better. But I used this white pen to do these stars and they don't look right. The planet looks okay, I guess, for watercolor. The ship, the shading isn't right and the form isn't that great, but you could take that idea and then but then some of this stuff, I feel is kind of cool, this house in this little wasteland. Yeah, I really don't know what caused that sort of jump from my doodles being random forms and shapes to being something with a little bit more meaning and I don't know what to call it, identity. Suddenly it wasn't just garbage on the page, although, I still do some of that. It started to become more like things. And I think one thing that's happened is as I'm drawing, it used to be that I would just draw shapes, and I would think about the shapes and getting the forms and doing the rendering, and I wouldn't really think too much about what the thing was. But lately I've started to kind of let myself imagine things as I'm drawing. So, I'm imagining this sort of, as I'm drawing this, I'm kind of imagining this sort of place in this kind of like gateway or something. I feel like the trees in the background here look bad. I'm kind of imagining this kind of like place where maybe like rituals are done or something. Or here I'm imagining like this sort of weird collection of asteroids and forms, and there's like these weird tunnels that connect them, and maybe people live there, and there's like transit stations or something. And I think really like imagining those details really helps you push things forward, even if those details aren't really well conveyed in the drawing. Like here, I'm imagining some sort of volcanic geology where things are bubbling up and it's smoking and smoldering. I don't know. And it's not that I start the drawing I don't typically start the drawing intending to draw those things. It's more like I start drawing some shapes and I start seeing that thing and I start imagining it more, and then I start trying to capture that idea. And I've started becoming better at that, I think. Here's an exception where I more or less went into this intending to draw basically this sort of like hidden doorway in some sort of ravine or something. And it more or less looks like that. Like some of my cross-hatching isn't that great. I think this looks a little bit better in the notebook, or like when it's small like this. People say to draw big, right? So it's kind of like if you blow up a picture until you can see the pixels, it doesn't look that good. Yeah, drawing big and then like shrinking things down helps some of those details become a little bit more lifelike. I really feel like the thing that has helped me push forward is really just letting myself imagine things as I'm drawing and then try to capture those things in the drawing. And like even when I'm doing these sort of, like this is me just trying to practice rendering forms again, but like here I ended up imagining some sort of weird instrument or various like little tools or something. And I think the forms are a lot more interesting when you do that. Here I drew this yesterday. And I went into this intending to draw some sort of like monolith thing. And then, I messed up one of the lines, and so I just decided, well, what if it was tied down? And then I kind of like drew this mountain around it, and then I started imagining, the people that live in these little villages around the mountain, and then there's like forests and things. And I think letting yourself imagining those things makes you try to draw them and suggest them into the drawing. And it's an interesting leap for me because it's not something I really predicted. Like I feel like a lot of the things that I've learned along the way I've seen in tutorials, or I kind of like had a strategy for how to learn based on, general like learning principles or whatever. But this thing was a kind of a surprise to me. And it reminds me of something I've heard, like if you ever watch some of the old Bob Ross stuff, he'll talk about, the squirrels and little gods critters, hiding in there and stuff. And I do wonder if maybe that is part of what makes Bob Ross's paintings look better than like somebody else who just watches his videos and does exactly what he says, but then isn't imagining those things. I think it adds that extra little bit of life to the drawing that wouldn't be there otherwise. So here's like another example, like this was just me drawing some squiggles, but then I started imagining kind of like this being an underwater kind of creature, and it's sort of dangerous looking, so I gave it these sort of stripes and things. And I mean, it looks better. It's not an amazing drawing, but it looks better than it would have had I just kind of like drawn some squiggles and left it at that. I've been trying to learn to use colored pencils this week because I've been drawing in this notebook, and I've had some experiences where some of the stuff bleeds through. This is a scene from kind of my neighborhood. I walk by this house all the time where it kind of sits under this water tower, and I feel like the juxtaposition and the color kind of looks cool. I might try to paint this a little bit better in the future. But well, that's a pretty cool painting, I think. So going forward, I'm going to start working digitally as well. I'm going to learn to do painting in Photoshop, and then also maybe learn to use SketchUp in Blender. I also want to play around a bit with acrylic and oil paint, and I have a few other things like that that I still want to try. I might play around with a bit with sculpting. I have a bunch of sculpting clay that I intended to use at some point, and I never have. So mostly I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm just going to keep making stuff every day, mixing things up, learning from other people, and we'll kind of see where things get in the next 1,000. I will continue to post everything that I draw in this progress album. So if that interests you, you can check it out there. Again, there's a link in the description below. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching.